Welcome back to the Locker Room Podcast. It's Ross Bennett hosting today on our newly revamped performance space around the Locker Room Podcast. We've gone off into different branches, which I'm really excited about. And today I welcome Luke Passman. Luke, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I said show there. I meant to say pod. Show makes it sound very American, but we'll get onto that in a minute. Luke, it's a pleasure to have you. Currently head of performance services at Chelsea Football Club Academy. Previously with the Mets in America, done some stuff in Spain, south of Spain, with some tennis academy. So we're going to come on to all of your stuff in a minute, but it's a real pleasure to have you on. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. So it's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to this.
Brilliant. So we're going to jump straight in a minute, but just a little bit around the membership on DSS, if those listeners that don't know. So Daily Sports Science is an online platform that provide coaching, performance support, holistic support, really, all online platform and loads of different resources on there. So if you're not aware of us or been on the website, please go to dailysportscience.com and have a little look. Our Locker Room Podcast is free to everybody and is a little side branch off the business. So please head over there if you haven't been there already. So Luke, obviously we've got a mutual friend who works with me, and we've never really got into the nitty gritty. So I'm really looking forward to this. And I've heard you on a previous podcast, and mate, it was excellent. So I'm delighted to get you on and share some details to our listeners. As usual, give our listeners, we got a real range of listeners, from Gaelic football coaches, some soccer coaches. I call it soccer because the Irish call it soccer, but football coaches, some performance, like physical performance coaches, and all of the performance areas. Give us a little background of your journey and just take us on a whistle-stop tour from education all the way to where you are now, if you can, mate.
Sure, I'll try and keep it brief to not bore everyone. It's a slightly different journey. Probably not the one that's sort of most typical or the one most trodden compared to most. But so grew up in London, like educated here, then went to university up in the northeast in Teesside University, sort of around the Newcastle, Middlesbrough area. And I did an internship with the Newcastle Falcons for a year. Worked for Teesside Uni with its sort of TASS program, with a group of athletes from various different sports, some rugby league, some netball, some volleyball, a load of middle distance runners, some Greco-Roman wrestlers. So did that for 2 years, and then was very lucky to be offered a job out in the south of Spain for Soto Tennis Academy. So I worked for the academy for a total of 7 years, with the first sort of 4 years solely working sort of with the age groups and with the academy. Started off as the lead S&C, and then as the team sort of built, moved into a more of a head of S&C role, and then in the last 3 years moved into a head of sports science support role, sort of overseeing all the individual different disciplines within performance. So S&C, sports science, medical, nutrition, psychology. And with that, I also traveled anywhere between sort of 15 and 25 weeks a year on the tour, on both the men's, the women's, and also the ITF age group tour. And then after that was very fortunate to be offered a job in the States with the New York Mets in baseball. So some similarities there between those two sports, rotational sport, overhead sport. One's a racket sport, one's a throwing sport, but a lot of sort of similarities in terms of how you'd go about sort of coaching that, but also some very big differences as I learned, as I sort of went further into that journey with the Mets. And then also on top of that, did some private work with two professional female tennis players, one junior, one senior. So have some further experience over those 5 years or so on the tour at a professional level in tennis still. And then most recently have actually taken the plunge to come back to the UK and now working for Chelsea within the academy system, overseeing the performance sciences space. So another sport, and enjoying working in football currently. So that's my sort of journey from start to finish.
Yeah, very impressive, mate. I must quickly ask you, like, how have you adapted? As you said, there's some similarities in terms of the sport around throwing and overhead, but how have you adapted to the difference in cultures? Like every sport you go into has a slightly different culture and nuance. What have you done to kind of, like, I guess, not only blend in, but then maybe shift that narrative away to where you want to create it to?
Yeah, it's that certainly in itself is definitely a skill, and a skill that I had to learn. I think on top of that, an additional layer is not only the differences in the sport and the culture of the sport, but also the cultures of the country as well. So obviously one was Spain, the other was America, but also within America, there's the Latin culture, because there's a site in, or an academy with 100 or so players in the Dominican Republic. Then you've also got your sites in the US and Florida and in New York. And then obviously now here in England as well. So each one has their own different culture as a country, and each sport has its own different culture and ways of working. So I think ultimately it comes down to some pretty key principles, which are quite universal and transferable, especially to leadership, which is you've got to be curious and you've got to listen. You've got to use your ears and your mouth in the proportion that you were given them. So you want to try and absorb as much information as you possibly can to understand what are the norms, within that culture of the country, but also what are the norms within that culture of the sport. What are maybe some of the gaps within those cultures, which maybe people that have only been exposed to those sports or to within that country maybe are maybe unsighted to and aren't aware of, which maybe further down the line, as you sort of deliberately try and nudge things forward and move things in a certain direction, you can start planning ahead in terms of how you might sort of change some behaviors or certain processes around some things which maybe they're not aware of. So I think ultimately a lot of it just comes down to just being quite aware of the fact that there are going to be differences. You don't need to say everything at once, and you need to try and listen as much as you possibly can to identify where those differences are, but also what are the ones that are important and what are the ones that are not important. What are the ones you can maybe try and tackle, and what are the ones that it's probably best not to.
Brilliant. Thanks, Luke. I mean, just from my own experience, so I'm predominantly in football, and you've come into that world now. I dabbled in Gaelic football for 5 years and did some stuff with TASS athletes before that. But I think now it's becoming more and more evident around people from multi-sport background coming into football. I think it's been like it's boomed in the last year or two, and it's opened my eyes massively. Just a difference in thinking. For example, match day -1, we've had examples in the last 2 years where we just took players off pitch match day -1 just for general load management. Now, from a cultural perspective, that would never be like thought of before, like especially in I guess senior level or even academy level, because it has to be your prep day. But just little examples of that, of people blending into different sports where they've got exposure of different things, I think are only going to benefit every sport. So I'm sure you're bringing in some nuanced stuff from sport to sport. You touched upon leadership there, Luke, and it's really nice. I want to blend into your leadership style a little bit, because you're in quite a nice leadership role at the minute, and mainly in the Mets, you did some really cool stuff. Could you talk to me about, I guess, the specific moment that you stepped into leadership, and I guess how you've transformed your style from when you first went into a leadership role to now, and what lessons you've learned?
Yeah, a very good question. I'd say probably the most abrupt sort of position where there was significant leadership responsibility was the one that I took on at the Mets. I would say I had progressively increasing levels of leadership in my role previous in tennis, but ultimately with it ending in me sort of overseeing everything within the performance department. But the size of a tennis academy where you have 40 players, you've got sort of around 10 members of staff that you're leading across, 10 to 12 members of staff you're leading across multiple disciplines, is a different beast comparatively to to an organization which there's over 300 athletes. There's also over 40 to 50 members of staff across the wider support team. And just within the S&C department, there's 14 members of staff. When we add in three other departments on top of that, it gets very, very big. And with it also being decentralized, we had teams in New York, we had teams in Florida, we also had teams in the Dominican Republic. There's multiple languages, there's multiple ways of working. That was probably the biggest jump. That was probably the time where I certainly felt, there was a significant responsibility on me to make sure that we're working together in cohesion and everybody's on the same page in terms of what direction we're going and why and how everybody fits in within that. So I would say that that role of moving over to the Mets was sort of the first sort of real big jump, but I'd had some apprenticeship and sort of feeling towards that in the years previous with my roles in tennis.
Brilliant, thanks, mate. And it kind of leads into my next point. There is like how important is it as a collective, even especially when your team's really big, that you have this shared vision and collective goal to work towards. And I guess how do you create that with various members of staff members from different lenses, from different competencies? Like, how do you really go about tackling that shared vision and making sure everybody's working towards it?
Yeah, it's certainly not easy. And I think some of it you do need some help from the wider organization. And I think at the Mets we were certainly very fortunate with that. There's a couple different ways in which you can create clarity. You can create clarity by being quite direct, quite clear in terms of where the direction is, but not necessarily consulting with a lot of people on what that might be. So you just provide a lot of clarity in terms of this is what it is. And I think that's what the Mets did. That was the tact with the Mets, and that was what they did very well. So we were clearly under with the understanding the Mets were in a win now cycle. And that means that ultimately we're going to spend money to win now. We might sacrifice some of our longer term player development for that goal. And also on top of that, we're looking to try and create change very, very quickly. And there's going to be some consequences to that, and it's going to be a bit of a bumpy ride. But ultimately, everybody has total clarity in terms of what the landscape is and what the direction of travel is. I think another way in which you can do it is to certainly consult, try and understand everybody's point of view, get everybody sort of working together and trying to have a voice and have a say in what the direction looks like. And therefore, when it then goes out and it becomes public, it's something that everybody feel that they can connect to. I think ultimately this comes down to the organization's way in which they want to try and create clarity for the wider organization, for the team. And then I think as then a department lead or a leader of multiple departments, you can then take that and you know what the wider direction of travel is for the organization. You say, okay, how do we fit into that? What are the things that we need to try and clarify that will align to that organizational goal? And what are the things that we know are probably not worth spending time on because they don't align? And I think ultimately you probably are going to have to align yourself to the speed, whether that's a slower process in the second example I gave, or whether that's a faster process in the first example I gave. You probably need to align yourself to an extent to that way of working. And then again, I think no matter what the situation is or the speed of travel is, you have to consult with everybody. You have to provide clarity in terms of this is what the wider organizational goal is. What does everybody think of the things that we need to try and improve and try and evolve and adapt? What are the things we need to immediately change now? And then take that, internalize it, and then send it back out to the wider staff and make sure that it's a representation of what everybody believes, but also it has your own spin on it in terms of the things that you're able to see while not being in the trenches, which potentially all of the other members of staff are, and maybe they can't see.
Yeah, excellent detail, Luke. The Wi-Fi here cut out a little bit, so I'm just going to summarize and just see if I got clarity on that. So the first one is just around providing pure clarity of this is our direction we're going to travel, but the second one involves some collaboration of how we're going to get there amongst the department and just creating a little bit of alignment with everybody in the team. Is that fair summary?
Yeah, totally.
What do you think the balance is then, depending on because look, I'm in a very similar situation, been a leadership role for pretty much similar time to you have as well across different spaces. The speed of travel is dependent on a couple of things around like competency of individuals, and maybe it just takes a little bit more time to get better alignment and just show people like the way that we want to travel, or influence in a bit more of an indirect way. Like, do you think there's different times where you need to just be a bit more direct to get there faster? Or do you think ultimately for long-term collaborating, creating stuff together, irrespective of maybe knowledge gaps and personnel changes over time, that's going to create better long-term stability in the department?
I think ultimately it does depend, and I know that's a terrible answer, but there's a couple sort of key principles that around the decision making, which will sort of help at least helps me to understand, is this something we need to move fast and potentially break things, or is it something we need to move slowly and build progressively? And I think ultimately it comes down to, is it something, is the area or the space that we're looking at and we're currently evaluating something which immediately aligns to the longer term goal? Is it going to have a high impact and a low cost? If that's the answer to that is yes, then you move fast and you potentially break a few things. If the impact is high and the cost is going to be incredibly high, then you move a little bit slower in that direction. And I think if there's anything that doesn't align immediately or completely directly to the wider organizational goal, then you can take time and you can build consensus. But if the impact is going to be moderate or low, and the impact or the cost is going to be moderate or low, and the impact is going to be very high, those are often the ones where you try and move fast and you take maybe a few hits along the way, because the impact and the reward is going to be much, much higher.
Nice, yeah, nicely explained. Luke, I've heard you use this phrase "flexible leader" before on previous podcasts, and something that you, I guess, believe in, and one of your principles. Talk to me about this concept and what does it look like from a practical perspective with different staff members.
Yeah, I think ultimately as a leader, you do have to be true to yourself. You know, your personality, your own personality is often going to shape, you know, how you are as a leader in quite a natural way. I think ultimately the number one thing as a leader, you have to be genuine and you have to be authentic. Certainly, I can only speak to my journey, but as I went through more and more years in a leadership position and also growing with more and more responsibility over more staff members and more departments, I certainly had to learn to be more flexible within my leadership style. And that comes into a couple different ways: more flexible in the way I listen, more flexible in the way I communicate, and then more flexible in some of the strategies that I use to try and anchor some of the impactful conversations, whether they be positive conversations or potentially some of the more difficult conversations. But ultimately, your own character, your own personality is going to form the foundation of how you go about leading. Some are much more passive and more empowering, and more facilitatory. Some are more leading by example and from the front. Some are more direct. You know, there's different styles, but I think ultimately you do need to take whatever your own internal style is, and you need to adapt it and mold it to the team that you have, and also where the team is on their own development journey. So, for example, the way in which you would lead with potentially a younger, more inexperienced team might be more from the front, might be more direct, might be more you know, directing, and also direct with your communication, because potentially that might be what the team needs at that moment in time, while also having a softer side, maybe, you know, in more private conversations and so on. But then if you have a team that's actually quite mature, quite experienced, very skilled, you probably then want to be a lot more hands-off, give them a lot more space, a lot more ownership, be significantly more facilitatory. And you'd also hope by that point, when as that team has grown and become more experienced, the processes take care of a lot of the things, and you can just make sure that you're overseeing from afar and maybe plugging a few gaps and a few blind spots, which again, as people are in the trenches, maybe they can't see, and providing more longer term mentoring. So that's an example of maybe, depending on the wider team, the characteristics of the team that you're leading, how you might need to be a different way to try and help that team grow and develop, but also help that team as a whole be impactful in their job. But it also then comes down to an individual level as well. You know, you might have some characters which maybe find more direct and harder conversations significantly more challenging, at which point you certainly maybe want to adapt your communication style to be have much more flex, to be more compassionate, to have much more empathy around those, and also understand that you might need to give them some space to digest some of the information that you've given them if it's a harder conversation and it's constructive. And then you also then probably need to spend a lot of time with them on the back end to really sort of support them in those next steps as they're trying to work through something, which maybe is an area of development for them. You might also need to be significantly more on the front foot with your positive reinforcement when things are going well. And that might be one way that which you might need to sort of handle one character or one personality within the team. Another example might be if you've got somebody that's really red hot, that's excellent at what they do, just stay out of their way. Just let them do their job, give them lots of empowerment, facilitate them as much as possible. Make sure that you're in the know with everything that's going on, so you understand when maybe they do need some help, or maybe when they do need a blind spot plugging. But ultimately, just let them be great and let them do their job and don't get in their way. And then you've got everything in the middle. And you've also got certain characters which will want and crave immediate and direct feedback because they're not threatened by it. And then those are the characters where, again, if you identify that, you've got to give it to them because that's exactly what they want. But then the first example, that might be exactly what they don't want. And it's also something that makes them feel very uncomfortable. But you can't not give it to them entirely. There will be times when you do have to give them some feedback and be direct, but you've certainly got to be much more, empathetic, much more compassionate, and then be with them afterwards to try and help them through that journey. Whereas with somebody else, you possibly just deliver the information and that's enough. They'll go and action it on their own. So I think it's looking at the characteristics of the team on a global team level, and also looking at the characteristics of each individual, but understanding those characteristics on where they are in their journey of young, potentially inexperienced, needing to develop, and ones which are significantly much more mature, experienced, and are really autonomous. And those are sort of the wider context of how you'd look at a team, but also individuals themselves, and how you'll need to flex your communication style and your support strategies for the team and also for the individual.
Yeah, excellent detail there, mate. Thank you very much. One of your big principles around leadership and your journey was about being curious and listening. I'm just like to delve a little bit in how you do that day to day. How much do you listen? What does that look like from a one-to-one basis or from a team collective perspective? Of course, it's going to be dependent on age and stage and different experienced people in the room. But what does that look like? How do you make yourself available to listen? But then also maybe listen and influence things the other way if needed?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think first and foremost, you certainly need to be present. I think being present is very, very important. And you do have to put a certain amount of sweat equity in as well. If you're present and you are there, you'll pick up and you'll see and you'll hear a lot of things just by being around. And I know that sounds like a bit of a fluffy answer, but to provide sort of the context to the contrary, if you're just clocking in and clocking out and doing your hours, you're not making the time, you're not seeing the wider schedule, you're not going in and sitting in on meetings, you're not just spending time, let's say, in the medical room or in the gym or in MDT meetings, even though they're ones that you don't necessarily need to be in. If you're not doing those things, there's a lot of things you're just not going to see, and there's a lot of conversations you're not going to overhear. And I think, or actually be part of. And I think with that, you do pick up a lot of information and you pick up a lot of the wider context of what's happening. And you get to understand a lot more around where each individual's departments, but also each individual staff member's unique constraints and barriers are. And you also get to understand how they go about problem solving those, potentially how they don't, and then how you can help them with that. That's something which is more unstructured. In more of a structured way, I think it's certainly helpful to have some form of formalized or semi-formalized consistent check-ins. In my previous roles, they were as consistent as, because it was decentralized, a weekly call. Sometimes that would be a 2-minute call. Not everything's good. Sometimes it would be a 20-minute call because the staff member actually has something that they want to bounce an idea off, or maybe there's something you need to proactively call and address, check and challenge, and then support them with on the back end. So whether that's a weekly check-in, a bi-weekly check-in, or if you're in the same building and it's more of a centralized system, let's say as football is, it's something where, monthly one-to-one, and you'll have, consistent sort of agendas of things that you want to work through as it links to maybe some longer term strategies or projects that staff member is working on an individual level, or potentially is working on more of like a department or phase level. So I think it is a blend of two things. You know, you have to be present and pick up a lot of the nuanced things that you're not going to get in any kind of structured format, and you've got to put in the time. And then also having some processes that give others an opportunity to come and bring issues to you, which maybe they wouldn't do if they're just passing you in the corridor, or if you're sat in on a meeting, or you're just there in the gym, or they're out on pitch, or they're in the physio room.
Yeah, really good points. I think also being in the trenches and having experienced and lived what those people are going through, or most of those people, you can relate at times to difficult situations, and also times where things are blending really nicely across NDTs. Luke, I'm just going to progress on a little bit to staff development plans, and you mentioned it there about a bit more of a formalized system around development of the individual. It's a big belief of mine that we focus so much on the player in elite sport around individual player development plans. Often the staff get a little bit neglected, and that might be down to structural, like hierarchical things. There isn't a person in place to actually really deliver that. I've heard you speak, and I know you're passionate about this. Talk to me about your staff development plans, how you formalize that process, and how you get the most out of individuals across a period of time.
Yeah, I probably taking a step back from the question first, and just sort of speaking specifically to what you just mentioned in terms of we do a lot of this around players, but we don't necessarily do it around staff. But if we try and sort of change the lens a little bit, what's the difference between, or at least I ask myself this question, but what's the difference between how we go about trying to deliberately and progressively develop a player towards an end goal, comparatively to a staff member, how we progressively develop them towards an end goal, whether that be their end goal in their career, or an end goal in terms of what they need to achieve for their job, what they want to achieve for their job and the role that they're in, or the roles that they can potentially move up through in the organization, or potentially elsewhere in a different organization. And I think within that, also an important piece, again, I'm just speaking for me, is an awareness and understanding, and being humble enough to say, we don't own any of these staff. If the staff members want to go somewhere else, that's totally up to them. You know, everybody has to make their own decisions that's best for their ambitions, best for their goals, also best for their professional and personal lives. So ultimately, if we if leaders, or if a club or an organization has that in mind, then they'll think, okay, how do we maximize this staff member for as long as we have them, and how do we try and make them the best that they can possibly be? The same as we try to with players. It then makes the process a lot easier of, okay, where are they at relative to their needs to be excellent at their job? But also ask them honestly, where do you want to get to? What do you want your next 1 to 2 roles to be? And ultimately, what is your end goal? Where do you want to be? Is it in this sport? If it is in this sport, great. Is it here at club? Is it potentially elsewhere? What is the role? Where are you trying to get to? Is your Mount Everest, the peak of Mount Everest, is it a first team pitch-based S&C? Is it a gym-based S&C? Is it head of performance sciences at first team? Is it director of performance? Is it potentially working in another country, in another sport, and testing yourself that way? All of these answers are totally okay. And I think understanding what that person's end goal is helps you as a leader to be able to connect to them, to be able to anchor a lot of your conversations, potentially where there are gaps. You can anchor it to what their end goal is. And if they say that they want to achieve something, potentially you have somebody that is working, you know, within a delivery role, and they want to work more towards a leadership role. And there's certain areas that they're not fulfilling in their job, which relate to that in terms of proactive communication, keeping key stakeholders involved, or potentially driving some projects forward, which will help them towards leadership positions. If they're not doing that, that's a very easy conversation for you to have, to hold them accountable, to say, well, this is what you said you want to get to, and these are the things that are going to help you get there, and currently you're not doing them. So let's talk around why that's the case. Are there some things that maybe we don't understand that's stopping you from doing that? And give them a voice. Let them speak first. And I think that goes back to one of your previous questions in terms of how do you go about listening? I think ask questions which give them an opportunity first to say, well, this is maybe something you don't understand that's stopping me here, and I need some help. And if there isn't anything, then it just becomes a really clear, honest conversation around, okay, well, this is something that is going to help you towards your end goal, and it's currently not being done. It either just needs to get done, or we need to support you further with X, Y, and Z. And I think understanding where they want to get to long term helps them and you maximize their current output within their role, and it also helps maximize them and gives them ambition and gives them a pathway for them to see how they're going to progress over time. And I think typically when you end up linking a lot of the work to what their longer term goals are, you get better outputs from the staff members, and they're much more motivated, they're more energized, because they can see that somebody is trying to push them to be better, and they also have somebody that's trying to facilitate them to be better and give them opportunities long term.
Excellent. Thanks, Luke. I found a really powerful tool, and you mentioned it there, is where you can align interpersonal development to their North Star and their next role with departmental KPIs and organizational KPIs, because it just makes really nice synergy. And it means that you're helping the person as well as developing people for the organization, which is nice. Luke, talk to me a little bit, last little piece on leadership, about managing up the chain and how like you influence stakeholders and key decision makers around personnel, around decision making. Maybe it's about processes that's slightly outside your remit but might influence performance within the MDT. What's your style with managing up? Have you got any key tips around communication and influencing people above you?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it certainly comes down to listening. I think the more you can understand what's important to your key stakeholders, the more you can connect with them. In the same as we were talking there about staff development, understand what's important to them, and then you can anchor a lot of your messages to that. It will connect to and land with them a lot more, and you'll get a lot more traction and buy-in further down the line. So I think understanding what's important to those key stakeholders is key. And then second to that, having proactive communication. So don't wait for opportunities to try and connect the dots. Go out and proactively do it. So I think having, and everybody will have their own ways of doing this, but actually spending time to deliberately sit down and identify, okay, what is important to the organization across all of these key stakeholders, and then what's important to each one of these key stakeholders on an individual level. How can I connect as a wider perspective, and how can I connect with each individual alone? And then how am I going to hold myself accountable to systematically communicate with all of them or individually on a consistent basis, whether that's monthly updates, whether that's quarterly updates? How do you go about doing that? Is that a meeting? Is it actually something that you send out, which you'll then follow up in person with? There's lots of different ways in which you can showcase a lot of the work and the projects that are being done without necessarily being given an opportunity to do so. And that's a fine line, because you don't want to be sort of seen to be, essentially doing a whole lot of things that say, hey, look at me and all of the great work that either I'm doing or all of the staff are doing. But it needs to align to what they care about, and also what the wider sort of organization directional goal is. And I think second to that, your point was around how do you go about aligning maybe certain key initiatives or certain key things that staff members are doing. I think, again, if you understand what's important to that staff, to that key stakeholder, every communication you have is an opportunity to get information in and align it to what's important to them. So don't waste any opportunities when you do have them, because it might just be a conversation in the corridor, or it might just actually be a conversation in the changing room.
Very nice. Some really good detail around leadership there, Luke. Thank you very much. I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit now to this notion around performance modeling, and I've heard you talk about it again on a previous podcast. And I've worked with somebody so I kind of understand your way of thinking. But just speak to the listeners a little bit around this notion of performance modeling. What does it mean to you, and how do you go about this process?
Yeah. So to steal an analogy from someone we both know, Michael Main, I think the number one thing here is start with the end in mind. So again, another analogy is whenever you sat in your car and you're opening Google Maps or Waze and you're trying to sort of plot a journey and you find the best journey, there's always two pieces of information that the GPS needs to have. Where are you going, and then where are you starting? And then everything else is then dependable on a whole load of different factors. And I think ultimately this is exactly the same. I think performance modeling is just trying to understand, okay, what is the end goal? And then where are we currently right now? And in the space of performance modeling, the end goal is probably the most important piece. If you don't have that, you can't create any of it. So for an example, to use an example, something of which I've done in a previous role is you can either take performance modeling from an in-game metric performance perspective, or you can look at it potentially from an availability perspective. Performance modeling, in my mind at least, is another sort of term for reverse engineering. How do you take some information and then work backwards from that to best understand what contributes to that end goal or to that end point? So in performance modeling from a genuine performance perspective, you can take an in-game metric, let's say in the context of football, let's say win duels percentage. You can take that, a ground duel or an aerial duel, and then you can take all of the performance profiling metrics that you have, and then you can then try and understand via statistical modeling, okay, what are the physical performance metrics that most align to the players that have the highest win duels percentage? You can then add in other metrics. Okay, are there certain contextual factors in terms of who initiates contact first? Are there other contextual factors around anthropometrics, height, weight, these kinds of things? So it's essentially understanding, okay, what is the key in-game metric which we're trying to better understand? And then what do we think are all of the sub-factors which potentially might contribute to us getting the greatest level of clarity on what's important or not? So, this is something which ultimately originated, or at least to my knowledge, and mine certainly isn't exhaustive, but to my knowledge, I think originated largely in Olympic sports, where the sports are significantly more closed. There's much less context than there are in field sports, let's say like football. And it's a lot easier to do this in baseball because of the number of data points, and also it is much more of a closed skill-based sport. For example, take pitching and hitting. It's easier to do that. But I think it certainly is possible to a greater degree than maybe is sort of initially thought to do so in team-based sports. So long as you have a real good understanding of what are the in-game metrics that are important and are going to give us rich and meaningful information, and then working backwards from there.
Yeah, really nice explanation, Luke. Thank you. And you was the first one to drop Mike's name in, so he'll be happy. I was going to ask that about how when determinants of sport become a blend of, let's say, physical determinants, and the statistical percentage of physical might shift to tech success or environmental factors, like how important is it then that you work really, really solid with like key coaching stakeholders and coach development or head of coaching to then work those things in tandem? Or is there been examples where that's not been the case, but you still had really good outcomes?
I think, yeah, good question. A difficult one. I think ultimately it's very difficult to answer that question with real certainty unless you're in a very unique and privileged environment where you have data that's organized and archived in a very clean way, where you can then and you also have a data team, whether that be a performance insights team or a data science team. You have a very strong and capable team with good bandwidth to be able to ask specific questions to understand, okay, what's, using that win duels example, what is the key factor? Is it stature and then initiating contact, which is something which has a little bit of a blend? Is it just initiating contact first? Or is it just pure physical capabilities? And I think ultimately those are both questions that can be asked, but somebody has to go through the data and go through and spend the time trying to unpack a lot of that context and also understand how reliable and valid the data actually is, and blending that quantitative and qualitative information to try and get those insights. I think without that, ultimately it comes down to using our best knowledge and tacit experience as practitioners to try and understand and watching the game. Something that's incredibly important is not to get bogged down by looking solely at data. You have to watch the game and you have to see what's happening in football, in football's case, out on pitch or out on field or on the court, whatever it may be, because that will tell you a lot. It will tell you a lot that maybe the data will lag behind and will tell you later on, but you're already seeing it with your own eyes every single day if you're looking. So I do think in football and rugby, there are certainly examples where it's much more of a chaotic team-based sport, where there are examples where physical determinants certainly have contributing factors, but they're not the only contributing factor. There is a lot of context and there are a lot of exceptions to the rule where you have players that maybe don't have the greatest physical stature and don't have the greatest physical outputs, but they're incredibly effective in some of these in-game actions because they read the game very well and they understand, when to for example, initiate contact, when to get their opponent off balance, when to make a move when they're not in the correct position, and so on. So I think it is a blend. It depends on what capabilities and capacity you have with the team that's around you to be able to ask those questions in a data way, or if you have to use your own eyes.
Really nice. I really like the summary, and just to echo I think some of the good work I've done in collaboration with coaches is around the coach piece. For example, on aerial duels, it's around the timing of the contact. So the contact initiating first, but when do you initiate contact in relation to the ball in the air? And it's that coaching expertise that blends with your, I guess, lens around physical dominance that creates success. So really, really nice explanation. Luke, could you explain your concept around focus programming for me? I've heard you talk about it a little bit before. And what does it look like? And what does it look like, the development of it over time with an individual?
Yeah, for me, I think it comes down to two things. And I think that the first one relates back to what we were just talking about in terms of, so you asked the question around, what are some of the examples or what are some of the situations where maybe you work with coaches and you're blending some of the physical and also the technical and tactical. I think having a really strong IDP process is key to being really effective in that work. And it's also really key to being effective with how precise and directed your program is, as is the performance modeling piece if you're able to do that. Not everyone is able to do that. That's something where you certainly need to have a very large, you need to have a very capable team with multiple departments and multiple skill sets to be able to do that. But I think if taking an IDP process where there's real clarity in terms of what are the areas of work from a technical and a tactical perspective, and what does that look like on pitch? So again, let's take the simple example of win duels. We have a striker that needs to improve his win duels percentage in two scenarios. One, when he's receiving the ball with back to goal, to feet or to chest, or the other where the ball's played into the channel and he has a shoulder contact with the centre back or the fullback into the channel, and we want to have a higher win duels percentage there. He needs to get better at that. That may be something that we track objectively, or it may be something that's tracked subjectively, depending on your environment and context and what availability you have of data. But then working back from that, okay, what are some of the physical determinants that either we have statistical certainty is going to make an impact on that, or we think from a tacit experience perspective and using our eyes, we think it's going to have an impact. Let's say that player needs to increase lean muscle mass and also needs to increase peak force strength. These are two areas. On top of that, if we know the player needs to increase lean muscle mass, then we know there needs to be some nutritional intervention that works in lockstep and side by side with any kind of S&C programming. So with that, there's a clear hierarchy and working backwards, again, using the principle of understand the end goal and then work backwards from it. What are we trying to identify on pitch? What are we trying to impact? What needs improving? What are the physical characteristics and capacities that are most likely going to impact that in a positive way? And what are the secondary interventions that support that, those physical determinants or capacities? And then everything is then aligned. All of the conversations throughout the MDT team on that one goal is aligned, and there's real clarity for the coaches, but also for the player, why they need to improve that, how that it's going to be measured, and then also how all of the other support departments are going to work and align to try and help them with that. So it creates a lot more clarity around why does that player need to increase their caloric intake or potentially increase protein intake. They need to eat more frequently. They need to change their habits around breakfast and around dinner and around snacks. Why they're going to start doing a different program where there's increased time under tension, there's increased volume in the gym, there's increased frequency of gym sessions, etc. They understand why it's important, because ultimately the only thing that matters to players is their pitch performance. That's all they care about, regardless of any sport. So I think that's one. I think a clear IDP process is really important. Speaking specifically just to S&C programming as it relates to performance modeling, I think if you are in an environment where you have the privilege to be able to start collecting lots of objective data and then running statistical analysis on that data, it can, and again, I've been in a position where I've been lucky to have been in an environment where, in my previous role, where we've been able to do this, is take some in-game metrics, take all of our performance profiling metrics, and then understand which have the greatest link to high outputs of those in-game metrics. So, for example, taking baseball, hitting and pitching. Taking two in-game metrics from there, pitching velocity and then also exit velocity off the bat, so how hard someone hits the ball. Both of those are highly, highly correlated to strikes thrown and then home runs hit. So taking those and then taking all the performance metrics and then seeing, okay, to specific thresholds, what are the top 5 metrics that link to those in-game metrics at a certain level, which we are confident is going to impact either strikes thrown or home runs hit. And then from there, you have clarity in terms of what are the physical capacities that we need to develop to improve our players' ability to have a physical capacity to be able to impact the ball hard, whether that be throwing or hitting. Now, that doesn't take away any sort of technical modeling in terms of, is their swing correct? Is their arm path correct with their pitching? Are they gripping the ball correctly? All of these technical things, and you can take this and use different sports as examples, maybe kicking technique or so on. Timing of a run, timing of a header or a jump or what have you. It doesn't answer any of those questions, but what it does do, it can create clarity in terms of if we're seeing somebody is not able to do something on the pitch or on the court or on the field. Is it because they don't have the physical qualities, or is it because they need to improve their technical capabilities? So it allows you to start bucketing players in terms of needs more physical capacity, needs some physical capacity and some technical work, but more physical capacity than technical. Then the flip side needs more technical, but still some physical, but not a lot. And this player has everything they need from a physical capacity to be able to execute these technical outputs, but they're not good enough technically. So then that allows you to have more precise and direct conversations with coaches around where the gap is. What are going to be the most impactful interventions? Potentially with one player, player A, they maybe need more gym sessions. They maybe need more conditioning sessions. And that's the initial focus for the first X number of months. Player B, maybe you say, we actually need less gym time with this player and they need to spend more time with you. And also our gym programming needs to change. So we start using more of a complex and a varied constraints-based approach with that player that links to the technical model of which we're going to try and improve, because he has all the or she has all the physical capabilities to execute what we want them to do out on field, pitch or court.
Mate, really, really nice job explaining some IDP and complexities underneath the IDP. So well done. The listeners are going to get some fantastic stuff around that. I'm just going to go into something that you mentioned there, and you brief it at the end around like training a physical capacity. And by physical capacity, I'm sure you'll come on to defining it, but in terms of like a physical term or actually a movement skill. And we have conversations, me and Mike have conversations all the time around a lot of things are done somewhere in between. But actually, I think it's really important you identify through the performance modeling and the IDPs, do we need to go after a physical capacity, or is it a skill where you might use some constraints-based stuff within the weights room and how that transfers over? Just enhance on the IDP process a little bit and just explain to the listeners, like, what does it exactly mean when we're saying physical capacity, and what does it exactly mean, and what does it look like when you're actually developing a movement skill with some of that constraints like theory approach entwined?
Yeah. So I think probably the easiest example, or most simple example I can give is um, whether someone is able to accelerate effectively. Let's say if we take that, and we have a couple different ways of being able to sort of identify where the gaps are. So we have all of our force plate data, we have all of our physical profiling data, but on top of that, we have video analysis and biomechanical analysis around how the player moves. And again, you have two different players. You have one player which is moving very, very efficiently. There's no real concerns. There's no real big gaps in terms of how that player moves relative to an acceleration technical model. But they're very, very weak from a capacity perspective. So in short bursts, they're able to accelerate well, but they deteriorate quite quickly over time. And you have player B, who has all the physical capacities that they need. They're very explosive. They're very strong relative to their body weight. They're also very strong on an absolute level relative to all of the opponents they're going to face on the field. And then on top of that, they're very, very robust. But then the biomechanical and video analysis shows that the way they move is very, very inefficient. And they have one specific area of sort of weakness, which is calf strength or soleil strength in a bent knee position, which relates very directly to the ability to be explosive in an acceleration position, because it's all with the bent knee, or predominantly, which is the difference between acceleration and high speed running. So there we have one small, in player B, we have one small difference, one small deficit, but everything else is looking good. And we also have then a deficit in terms of how that player moves. That player B will work on maybe one specific quality in their gym session, which is a capacity. So soleil strength in a bent knee position. But then there'll be lots and lots of movement or work around movement on pitch to try and change their running technique. Now, that might be increased hip extension or propulsion force. That might be a greater knee drive. That might be less trunk rotation, and you might constrain these in multiple different ways via dowels, hand positions, aqua bags, holding med balls, these kinds of things, or potentially using med balls as projectiles to try and get them into better positions. That would be working a technical capacity around running. And the other would be player A. The other player would be not leaving this alone and just making sure it doesn't change to the detriment, but giving them all the physical capacities and qualities for them to be stronger relative to their body weight, be stronger relative on an absolute level to all of the opponents they're going to face on the pitch, but also on top of that, being more explosive on a general global perspective, but also in key positions and in key joint angles specific to the task of acceleration.
Really, really nice. And I think it's important for the listeners that, like you said, maintenance of certain movement skills, you might sprinkle that in team prep based on the theme of the day, for example. So you might still have some element of movement prep and movement skill maintenance or development in that, but the specific work comes down to reverse engineering of what you want from each individual. Luke, really, really nice. Last question, then we're going to wrap up a couple of summary ones, if that's okay, mate. You've been heavily involved in the development process. So a lot of places you've worked, practically every place you've worked has had an accountability around the development side and long-term athlete development. Can you just give the listeners a few nuggets? And I guess the North Star is probably really important from reverse engineering, but a few nuggets of how you go about that development process from kind of bottom age group what you work with and age and stage, and how you progress up to that North Star if they're lucky enough to progress through the pathway.
Yeah, again, it very much comes down to the principle that we talked about before in terms of clarity of outcome, or clarity of what the end goal is. So identifying what is the end point. So, you know, when creating a long-term athletic development model, there's a lot of different things that you have to think about and incorporate, especially when you're working through age groups. It's a little different if you're only working with adult professional athletes. Maybe, you know, coming into the system at the age of 18 or 21 and then going all the way up into 30s and so on. But when dealing with age groups, there is certainly an additional layer. But the principle still remains is, what do those set of athletes or players need to have when they reach their end goal? whether that's men's first team football, women's first team football, whether that's Major League Baseball, whether that's women's WTA tennis or men's ATP tennis. What are the physical qualities that they need to have to be competitive at that level? And getting a lot of clarity around that. And I think ultimately that's the first point. And from there, you can then really work backwards in a stepwise process to understand, okay, what are the key landmarks or areas of transition based on our unique context? That might be in baseball, working through the player development pathway system and all of the different affiliates and levels of the leagues that they will move up in, whether that be youth tennis or age group football. That might be the phases of FDP, YDP, and so on, when they're in full-time school, when they're not, and so on, things like this, time availability, when they're going through maturation or the highest levels of maturation and so on. When they're going through all of that and trying to understand how you go about adjusting your program. But I think first and foremost, having clarity, what are they going to have to do, which is almost non-negotiable when they get to their endpoint? What qualities do we need to develop? And then making sure that those are progressively in a stepwise way being developed throughout the entire pathway and system. And then second to that, what is the entry point? What does the entry point look like? What are the ages? What is our level of contact time? What are the key movements that we want to try and instill from the very beginning? And there you have your start and your endpoints, and then the context of everything in between shapes how you go about building that out. And that's going to be different depending on the sport, depending on whether there's age groups or not, and also depending on the genders, whether you are with multiple genders, as you may be in tennis, or whether you're with one single gender, as you may be in women's football or men's football, let's say. I think there's probably too much in the middle to sort of go through all of that. We could probably talk for another 30 minutes if we would unpack all the context, but I think ultimately understanding that endpoint, getting as much clarity as you can on it, and then trying to understand, okay, where is our starting point, and then how do we create that journey to bridge the gap to get from start to end?
Yeah, Luke, really, really nice. We could do a whole podcast on that. Maybe that'll be part two. But I guess having that alignment piece and integration, which is now, I think, coming into more organizations about, like, whether it be first team football, whether it be top end, having that interaction with staff all the way through the journey and not having this disjoint from academy to first team in my thing is huge on that, having that clarity in place. I'm going to do a couple of wrap-up questions, if you don't mind, and you haven't seen these, so they're not going to be too complex, but I wanted to chuck a couple new ones at you. First of all, talk me through, you've got really comprehensive knowledge, understanding, leadership experience, processes, principles. The listener's going to take so much from this. Talk me through your influences in your career, like what people have influenced you the most, at what stage of your career and what part of your journey?
Fourth has been a lot. I'd say a very consistent one actually is our mutual friend Mike. He's a very, very good friend of mine, but we talk a lot of shop, we chew the fat a lot, and we bounce a lot of ideas off each other. So he's certainly been one. A huge one was a previous line manager of mine at the Mets, Alex Ross. I was very, very fortunate to work with him. One of the most technically competent and smart human beings I've ever worked with. Checked and challenged me a lot. Was very hard in terms of how much he pushed, but I learnt more in the few years that I worked with him than I probably did in any other stage of my career. And then also I would say also some other external mentors that I've been fortunate enough to work with. Alex Wolf has certainly impacted and influenced me a lot around my reflective practice in particular. And then John Pryor as well, particularly around sort of movement skills, running skills, and using a constraints-based approach. So I'd say I've been very, very fortunate to work with and be friends with some very, very, very smart people. And I've also been fortunate to be in environments where I've had people that I either work with or that I report to at times really push me and set the bar very, very high. So yeah.
Excellent. Luke, thank you very much. And the last one from me is you've had some really good roles and big roles, and you've had a lot of influence on different pathway programs. What's the future for you? What's your North Star?
Um, that's an ever changing sort of process. I spent a lot of time, working abroad, from the age of 23 to 35, and then recently I've moved back. So I've experienced lots of different countries and lots of different sports. Um, I'm very, very interested in football and taking a lot of the things I've learned in other sports and other environments and trying to bring them to football as much as possible while respecting the unique culture and constraints of football. Um, I think ultimately long term, I'd love to be a performance director one day. Um, but I'm also very, very much enjoying right now, um, being able to do what I love while also being very close to my family, which I've not been able to do for the last 13 years. So I'm originally from London. All my family is here. My parents are here. So it's nice being able to see them more often. But long term, I'd like to sit in the top seat and be a performance director one day and help bring teams together, and try and help create a very impactful but very, very efficient performance department. I think that ultimately is what gets me really excited.
Nice. Well, I'm sure you're on the trajectory to get there and be a very successful performance director, mate. I thoroughly enjoyed today's chat. Thank you so much. The listeners are going to get so much out of it. It's so many bits in there, and I just really appreciate your time.
No problem. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Just so that people, if they want to follow up on a few things, social media wise, are you fairly active on there? What platforms do you use?
LinkedIn and Instagram. LinkedIn, I'm very active. And Instagram is sort of more of a personal. I don't really do Twitter. I don't get on there. It's a little bit too, at least for me, I think it's a bit too toxic and a little bit too aggressive. There's too many arguments going on there. So I generally keep it to LinkedIn or Instagram. If anybody wants to reach out, they can message me on either of those, and I'm on it several times a day. So those are the two best ones.
Excellent. Luke, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, mate. And I look forward to chatting to you soon.
Likewise. Thanks.